Monica couldn't be here. She's about to have a baby. I'd like to welcome everybody here, and we're very excited to have Holly, and she's an amazing artist. Holly's work has been exhibited both locally and internationally, including Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, New York, North Adams, Boston, Sao Paulo, and Paris. Her work has also appeared in numerous publications and university lectures. So, I'm here to introduce her, and we're very excited to have her.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you for the introduction, Yulia. Like I said, really good to see you here on Thanksgiving weekend, and I wish Monica could be here, but we wish her the best with the delivery of her young heir. So I see that we have a lot of intellectual savvies in the crowd here, so I just want to mention that maybe we'll leave the Q&A for the latter part. I know that this is a tempting subject to get into political debate, but just for the sake of getting through the many layers of my work, I'm going to try to get through that quickly and then open it up to more of a discussion format. So I was hoping that you guys would be talking amongst you about the pamphlets on your chairs that you may have found as you arrived. This was part of the inspiration for the show, and whereas these are from the 18th century, you might identify with them something very contemporary right now, which is all of the gossip magazines. I think Great Britain is very well known for that. However, back in the 18th century, they were much more lewd, quite disgusting, actually. And there's a couple of key themes that you'll note on some of these. Everything in French culture at that time was very symbolic. One of the symbols that you'll note on some of these propaganda pieces was the symbol of the ostrich. And that happened to be a play on words because Marie Antoinette was the Archduchess of Austria and married to the Dauphin of France to sort of create a political alliance between the two countries. However, France and Austria had historically been enemies, so Austrians weren't very popular, to say the least, and that became an attacking point in the pamphlets that were distributed around Paris. Now, where the ostrich comes in is ostrich in French is Autriche, and I think there's a very subtle difference between, I believe it's Autriche and Autriche, ostrich and Austrian. It was even further to Autrichienne at one point, which meant Austrian bitch. So in order to convey that, that was sort of worked in. You'll notice that there's one where one of Marie Antoinette's supposed lovers is riding what looks like an ostrich, but is more like a penis that he's riding. Incredibly lewd and disgusting. One of the first things that they started attacking her on in the press was based on fashion and the frivolity of her basic vices. She was taught at a very early age that fashion was incredibly important. In French culture, if you were to wear lace, the men, they would have lace on their jackets. If your lace was longer than somebody else's, it was a symbol of your place and class in society. The king had certain things that he could wear that other people couldn't. Certain colors you wore demonstrated your political alliance, certainly during the Revolution. Black, of course, was a color of mourning, particularly for royalty. During the Revolution, you could be sent to the guillotine simply for wearing a black ribbon in your hair. So she knew right from a very early stage that fashion was very important. Before she could be sent to France to marry who was later to become Louis XVI, she had to undergo a complete makeover. Austrians weren't that refined. She had to have her teeth straightened, pulled out without anesthetic. She had to have her hair defrizzed and spend, I think it was
120,000
120
million.
on her wedding trousseau. And when she arrived in France, they stripped her naked. She wasn't allowed to bring any Austrian clothing, even her pet dog, into France. They had to have her head to toe in French attire. And this importance on fashion was placed throughout her life. So that was often a topic in the propaganda that circulated. As I'm sure you all know, the French Revolution was a very powerful force. Enlightenment ideas had been spread about people thinking for themselves, and they started to question, why should we be supporting this minority that's not paying taxes while we're starving? So Marie Antoinette was a very public figure. She attended a lot of the operas, a lot of balls in Paris. She was at first quite loved and adored by the public. Unfortunately, her husband, Louis XVI, was spending an extraordinary amount of money to further the American Revolution against Britain. And since Britain and France were also enemies at the time, it was in their political favor to support this democratic war of independence. Unfortunately, by paying for almost every ounce of gunpowder that was used in the American War of Independence, they were basically putting themselves into incredible debt that they would never be able to recover from, as well as the kings of the past eras had also been draining the banks too. So because one thing that all of the political corruption led to one of the things that the sexual corruption demonstrated was a link with political corruption. So if you were corrupt morally or corrupt in the bedroom, it demonstrated your political corruption as well. So all kinds of rumors circulated about Marie Antoinette. Not only did she have numerous lovers, allegedly, including the king's own brother, but at a certain point they also began accusing her of the German vice, which is basically sleeping with other women. But they were not heavy-handed aristocrats, and she did not want anybody to be punished in her name. So, you know, they were somewhat kind people. They weren't absolutists in the traditional sense. You'll also recognize a lot of misogyny in these pamphlets. The idea that a woman could control the king, spend freely, have little chateaus built on the grounds of Versailles, this demonstrated a threat. Who is this Austrian bitch to tell us how our money should be spent? She became a great scapegoat for discontent of all kinds. Unfortunately, natural forces such as harsh winters and poor harvests, those were kind of ignored. And, you know, I think this happens a lot today when we, you know, I'm thinking about the current global economic crisis and how it's always convenient to find a scapegoat between the haves and the have-nots. And so often, you know, finger-pointing begins as soon as there's that sort of discontent. And France was a major world political power at the time. So, hello, Paul. So these pamphlets spread freely around the city. Now, so in looking at the work that I've created, I wanted to sort of present a counter opinion to that pop persona. I think today most of us, or at least I didn't until a few years ago, know a lot about Marie Antoinette, other than she was considered to be this sort of fashion icon, this frivolous monarch. And there's not a lot of good that's really stuck in our heads about her, other than those pop sort of ideas. So in exploring her life further, I've come to understand her really her personal life, her sufferings, her charitable acts, and I've created this body of work as an antithesis to the pop persona and propaganda that plagued her throughout her lifetime and ultimately led to her being guillotined. So I'm just going to go through each of the works quickly to give you a bit of an inside explanation. I think I should start sort of chronologically. Just behind Marie's head there, that one is in the chapel of Versailles. That's where the royal wedding took place. And that's also where important ceremonies would be held, such as the coronation of the king. Louis XVI had his coronation there. Unfortunately, his financial advisors decided that they could not afford to give a coronation to both the king and the queen, so the queen went without. For a spoiled queen, she never even received a crown. She was not crowned. She was not given a coronation, and she seemed to be okay with it at the time. So that's a little bit of a contradiction to her character that we're more familiar with. At the very back of the room in the sort of peachy pink dress, orangey peachy dress there, this addresses a very widespread and important scandal. The title is Marie Antoinette. Sorry, Paul, could...
Sure, it's Marie Antoinette under pressure to produce an heir after 7 years of unconsummated marriage.
Right. So, being an heir, a queen of a country like France or any country, the single most important task that you have is to be sure that that dynasty continues. There's incredible pressure from Austria. Her mother, the Empress of Austria, is writing her letters on a weekly basis, pressuring her to get pregnant, to bind the alliance between Austria and France. And of course, all of the people of France figure, if you don't start giving us children, then we should just get rid of you. So she was in an incredibly difficult position because her husband would not sleep with her. She was 14 when they were married. He was 15. You would think that it would come natural to them. Unfortunately, there's a few different theories on why they weren't getting pregnant or sleeping together. Scholars have been arguing about this, and a couple of the reasons that they have given is, first of all, because she's Austrian, and Louis was taught for so many years that Austrians are filthy, Austrians are, politically and morally corrupt. All of a sudden, he's got one in his bed, and he's supposed to have sex with her. It just, it was something he couldn't get past in his mind because he'd been taught this since early childhood. And he was actually a very timid young man. He was actually more scared of her. The more charming and alluring she became, the more scared he became, and he would simply just turn away from her. So she was really quite in a helpless situation, very distraught over what to do. Finally, her brother, Joseph, came from Austria and had a talk with the king, and one of the theories is that he discovered that they really didn't know how conception happened. So he would insert his member and remain there for 2 minutes, and then pull out without moving around, and then send her off, and then he would have a happy ending on his own. He wasn't aware of the whole seed factor. And there was no sex education back then. Nobody had taken the time to teach them. And oddly enough,
Louis XIV and XV
were scandalously voracious in their sexual appetites. You would think that he would follow suit, but he really had no idea. He was so clueless. Other historians argue that he had a rare disease where the foreskin is exceptionally tight on the penis, so arousal is actually quite painful. And for years they tried to convince him to have a surgery to rectify this, something like a circumcision. But, the medical procedures back then were always very risky. A doctor was more likely to kill you than cure you. allegedly he did have this surgery, but historians that have been revisiting this mystery have looked back at his hunting journals and have noted that there is not a single day that he did not go hunting during this alleged procedure. I'm not a man, but I can imagine if I had a surgery like that, I would not want to go out hunting and horseback riding the same day or the day after I had a surgery done. So they're kind of in agreement now that it was sort of a political cover-up, so as to give the poor king an excuse. So eventually, after Joseph visited, they did begin having sex, and she became pregnant. Eventually mothered 4 children, each of whom died in various ways. The figure to the left there, out in the gardens, Marie Antoinette, between these 4 children, she actually has 2 miscarriages. Back then, the average household had 6.5 children. She only had 4, and she was lucky she had those. There was a lot of sort of inbreeding amongst royals from country to country. Her and her husband actually shared an ancestor, Louis XIV, the Sun King. So quite often these children, because of this genetic inbreeding, they wouldn't survive very long. She lost her daughter, baby Sophie, just as a few months into her life. Her first son died of tubercular fever, and her last son, who would have been the heir to the throne, rotted and died in prison of negligence and abuse. So unfortunately, the dynasty did die. She was the last queen of France. Looking at this one here beside me, this Marie Antoinette declaring financial support for all French women to breastfeed their own infants. This came as a huge shock to me, that women of that time were not to breastfeed their own children. It was considered to be garish, very lowbrow, and it wasn't just in the royal family. It was everybody. So they had, have you ever heard of wet nurses? They had wet nurses, and these were busty women, usually peasant women, that were hired for the sole purpose of nursing infants. Now, they would often take on more than one. They would take on sometimes up to 6. These infants would die of malnourishment, disease. It was actually quite dangerous of a practice. And one of the French Enlightenment philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, wrote extensively on the natural order. And he encouraged women to mother their own children, breastfeed them, get back to nature, and of course breastfeeding is the most natural thing in the world. So she was one of the first proponents of that. She actually read Rousseau and followed quite a few of his philosophies. Unfortunately, looking at it from my own eyes, there's always that long-held belief that if you give a woman a baby, she'll stay out of trouble. So of course Rousseau wanted the women at home, breastfeeding, taking care of the house, that sort of thing. He had a really interesting effect on her. I have another work that's in progress that isn't finished to the point it could make it into this show, but Marie Antoinette was given a small piece of land and a tiny little palace, more of a chateau, called Petit Trianon. And on the grounds there, she had a hamlet built that resembled a play that Rousseau had written. And it was a charming little hamlet where there was sheep and cows. Milk was considered to be something very vital back then. Women would build pleasure dairies, sort of as a trendy thing amongst aristocrats. It reminds me a lot of the spas of today. Well, you get back to mineral baths and that kind of thing. Back then it was milk. So she thought she was living this rustic little life away from court etiquette, away from the formalities. However, her servants would go and clean the backsides of the sheep in the morning before she would get up, and perfume the lambs. So one of them was, apparently there was some that were even dyed pink for her delight. So it would have been a really charming little place, I'm sure. Marie and I have visited there a couple times, and indeed it was very whimsical. There's a little vineyard, there's all kinds of farm birds running around, there's a little pond filled with fish and geese, and she adored this place. She couldn't get enough of it. And this ended up being her own little empire, where she could say who could come and go, who could come and visit, and what they could wear. And because she detested the formalities of court etiquette, with everybody following her everywhere, having to wear the most painful corsets, tight clothing. Women were so constricted that they would often faint. They couldn't breathe in these horrible corsets. So when it came to the Petit Trianon, the women were to wear white muslin gowns. And these gowns demonstrated a new freedom. And I don't know if she planned it this way, but it also became a democratization of fashion, because what the courtiers complained of was that they could no longer tell a peasant woman from an aristocrat. Here are these duchesses and princesses and the queen running around in, a white sort of dress that's nothing more than a sash tied at the waist. They were loose-fitting, they were free, they were comfortable, and they didn't demonstrate a lot of class distinction. So of course the people surrounding her in Versailles were not very happy about this, but it became a huge fashion. Everywhere across Paris, this great fashion trend spread. And unfortunately, you would think that they would be happy, because this meant that she wasn't spending tons of money on lavish French silks and diamonds and velvets. But like I said, there's so much political symbology with everything that she wore. When her portrait painter presented a portrait of her in one of these dresses in a salon in Paris, they actually had to take the painting down because it became so scandalous. People were saying it's the queen painted in her nightgown, or they were likening it to peasantry, being a whore, basically anything corruptible they could think of. So, the poor woman was, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. They quickly replaced the portrait. Another interesting thing to note was that in a lot of her portraits, she's holding a rose. We might think it's a very harmless portrait, but those details were very politically charged, because the rose was the symbolic flower of the Habsburg family, her own family back in Austria, whereas the lily, or the fleur de lis, was the French flower of the Bourbon family. So often paintings had to be redone holding the correct flower in order not to cause political scandal. So when Marie-Thérèse, her first daughter, was born, she was insistent on breastfeeding her herself, until she was eventually convinced that breastfeeding was actually contraceptive. Kathleen, I looked into that, you're right. I've never mothered a child, so I didn't know, but apparently it's true. So they wanted her to continue having children, so they convinced her to hand her child over, her daughter, so that she could continue having children and hopefully have a boy. Of course, girls were not as important as sons at that time. And in adopting this philosophy, Marie Antoinette became aware that many women, middle class and even some lower class women, had gone to great extremes to live up to this standard. They had gone and put themselves in great debt to hire wet nurses, and they had racked up their debts so much by doing what was proper that they ended up imprisoned. And so, as a gift to the people, or to the women of France, Marie Antoinette used her allowance to pay off the debts of all of these women in prison and to free them. And, it's an extraordinary thing, very modern thinking for the time. She also took it a step further. She was so overjoyed at having finally had a child that she paid for the weddings of 100 couples through a mass ceremony, and she offered these couples a stipend if they would breastfeed their own children. So she really wanted to sort of encourage this, and I think that was a really progressive step, and one of the few times she had some political power. Let's see, behind you there on the back wall on the right, that is Marie Antoinette
Reading Rousseau's
discourse on the origins of inequality. It's actually discourse on the origins of the inequality of man, because women weren't really considered to be persons back then. But the irony is that there's this contradiction between this frivolous party girl and somebody who's actually intrigued and wanting to learn more. She's always asking for the latest books. What's the best literary book out there right now? And she would have them brought to her library, and she would read Rousseau and Voltaire. Ironically, it's the ideas of those Enlightenment philosophers that stirred the French Revolution, which ultimately led to her demise. So there's a really great irony there. I think had she had more political power, things might have gone a little bit differently, but women were not to be making political decisions at that time. So not too long after this, King Louis XVI realized that there was a lot of political discontent. I mean, he saw these pamphlets being distributed. He saw scandal after scandal against him and his wife and the royal family, and he knew that they were in a great debt, and he wanted to do something to help. So he formed the General Assembly. The General Assembly hadn't been brought together in, I believe it's 170 years, and this constituted basically the three estates. So the nobility, the clergy, and everyone else. And they were to get together and come to terms to create reforms. And there became a lot of pressure on the royal family to give up all kinds of privileges very quickly. Of course, their advisors had their own agendas. They didn't want to start paying taxes. They were living tax-free, so of course they didn't want the king to hand over these powers. And it was at this unfortunate time where they were being so reviled that their first son, the would-be heir of France, was actually dying of tubercular fever. And at the time, royals were not allowed to be in the same room or even in the same building as somebody that was dying of a lethal disease. They weren't to be around death. It was seen to be a bad omen. So their child was sent away and died very painfully. And when she received news of it, she was horrified, of course. And unlike previous circumstances of deaths in the royal family, nobody gave a damn. Normally, everybody would be wearing black as soon as they heard. Nobody changed their outfits. They were now wearing the wardrobe of the revolution. There was no mourning ceremony at all for somebody that was supposed to be so important, that was supposed to be the hope of France. So she was devastated, and they were not given even a day to mourn. They had to be back there in the General Assembly, facing the people, and being accused of all kinds of salacious activities, despite this very painful personal moment that they were going through. So this is Marie Antoinette upon the death of her firstborn son and heir to the throne of France. Not too much further after that, the revolution was really taking place. The storming of the Bastille had happened, and what that entails is the masses of people decided to attack Bastille, which was a very notorious prison, and they knew that gunpowder was stored there. They knew that massive arms were there. So they slaughtered their way in, basically, and by hand, dismantled the prison, either killed or freed the people that were in there, killed the guards, of course, and people had now armed themselves. They had the gunpowder, they had the weapons. So this was a huge moment, the storming of the Bastille, which is now celebrated as the 14th of July. If you've ever gone to Paris, I was there in Paris a couple years ago, and I happened to be there on July 14th, and the streets were just massively crowded, huge firework displays, drinking everywhere. To this day, it's still a huge, huge deal. It's something to see. So, shortly after that, the king surrounded Paris with guards to protect the order of things. And the people saw this as a real, well, they didn't take kindly to it. So these women, these fishmongers, really tough women that did hard labor day after day, pulling these big fish off the boats, and they came armed with something called pikes. We don't have pikes around these days, but it's kind of like a spike, a long iron spike with a hook on the end. They armed themselves with everything they could, kitchen knives, fishing pikes, all these sorts of things. And they marched to Versailles, which is about a half an hour train ride away, and they slaughtered their way in. They took a couple of the royal guards, beheaded them, and put their heads on these pikes, and forced their way into the palace, screaming for the head of the queen. They said all kinds of insane things like, I want a leg, I want an arm. They wanted blood, and so they went straight to her bedchamber, and fortunately or unfortunately, she had just escaped. It doesn't show in this picture, but there's actually doorways cut into the wall, right into the wallpaper. This beautiful floral wallpaper houses 2 escape hatches. And she had just fled down this corridor behind one of these doors moments before this horde of angry Parisians broke into her bedchamber. They thought she was still in bed, and they just started pummeling away with every weapon they had. And they were quite angry when they found she wasn't there. So she did survive this assassination. This image demonstrates her loyalty, not just to the people, but to God. She doesn't want this to be happening at all. Of course, she fears for her life. She wants her people to be pleased. She doesn't know where to turn. She's very young. Her husband is very young. They were not old enough or ready to reign over France. And it was this utter moment of helplessness and hopelessness. So, a lot happens after that, but I won't get into that. So, by comparison with some of the propaganda that's been passed around, I just wanted to sort of summarize that, the vices and virtues that the two are presenting. We've certainly heard enough about her vices in history, in movies, in sort of pop culture. So I wanted to draw a more humanizing effort to her personal life, her personal thoughts and moments, and express some of her virtues, which are have received so little exposure. I'm not saying she's not guilty. She was guilty of treason to a certain extent. She was trying to save her own life, but I think the French Revolution probably went a little too far. Certainly, the Reign of Terror, millions of people, people were slaughtered. 800 people a month were guillotined. You could be guillotined for wearing the wrong color, for complaining that the price of bread was too high. So the idea of the French Revolution, which was supposed to promote equality, liberty, and fraternity, I don't see any liberty in the censorship that started in the press, or the idea that you couldn't dare say the wrong thing to your neighbor, or you would be turned in and killed. Liberties were really repressed then, ironically, given the ideals of the Enlightenment. I wanted to talk a little bit about the mirrors, and I'll start with mentioning the place that they played in French history. Although mirrors date back to probably polished obsidian in 9000 BC, the plate glass mirror was developed in the island of Murano, which is near Venice. I'm sure some of you have been to Venice and you've seen the beautiful chandeliers and glass that comes out of there. That island has always been known for its glass, and Venice, I believe, was the ruling, the place of not just industry, but also the ruling power back then. A mirror like this could cost as much as 3 times the price of a Raphael painting. It was extraordinarily expensive. So the Venetians developed this process, and the French kings, of course, were envious. This would have been during the time of correct me, Louis XIV. And he was building Versailles at the time. And to show his power and wealth, he had the Hall of Mirrors built. Opposing all of these great arches and windows, on the opposite side are a number of panels of mirrors. And given the price at that time, this was an extraordinarily expensive hall that was produced. It became a historical hall too, because many great dignitaries, including American Democrats like Benjamin Franklin, came and they honored him there. General Lafayette. It was a way to show that France was rich and powerful. So that was quite important to them. And looking at it from a woman's perspective, and looking at it in terms of, I mentioned in my press release, civilized society, I think this mirror was a really important turning point, because the king had bribed Venetian craftsmen to bring this process to France and start producing mirrors there. And I don't think he expected what came about that. Suddenly, by having this object of self-reflection, you were able to see what you look like to other people. Before this, can you imagine getting dressed every day, doing your hair and makeup, having no idea how you look to other people? So a real sense of self-awareness developed out of the invention of the mirror. And as a photographer, I think it's also very important. The mirror, or the camera, could not exist without the mirror. It's probably the single most essential component of it. So it really not just proliferated self-awareness, but it also sort of democratized portraiture. You could now, artists could now start doing self-portraits. And also because of the camera later on, a portrait used to only be available to the most wealthy. Once the camera was invented, of course, anybody could pay to have their portrait done. So the mirror was really instrumental in French culture, and it was a lot of Frenchmen who were developing the earliest cameras. Now, thinking about it from a fashion viewpoint, it's interesting when I think about where the biggest luxury brands in the world come from. And many of them are either French or Italian. You think Prada, Chanel, Gucci. They're all coming from these places that were the first to have the mirrors. So that may have been really pivotal in why France became a real fashion capital, and Italy. And to this day, they still are. The mirror is really important to me in this exhibition for that and many other reasons. Perhaps what I'll do is explain each of the mirrors. I know some of you speak French, probably a lot better than I do. I did have to have help from some lovely French friends that often disagreed on translations. Some of them thought I was being too garish, others not garish enough. All of the quotes are original. I even Googled them to make sure they didn't subconsciously seep into my mind and come out again. I wanted to be sure that they were all me. This is my personal favorite. And it basically says, greed is a social lubricant. And this is something I've picked up mostly from my own personal life. And having a lot of anger inside me, and wanting to express that. It's something I see every day. The wealthiest people I know are also the most charitable people I know. But it's not considered appropriate to go out and talk about the number of charities that you donated to, or, you know, the good deeds that you do. Those are things that we're supposed to keep to ourselves. But unfortunately, the wealthy get asked for just about everything from just about everybody. And it's a difficult position. As soon as you have something, somebody wants it. Which kind of ties in nicely with this one here, Cassez-vous et laissez-moi seul. I had originally developed this phrase when I was staying in Paris. I had rented a studio to do a sort of self-imposed residency. And I didn't speak a lot of French except for very polite tourist French. And Marie was back in Vancouver at the time, so all of a sudden I was this single woman going around Paris with my camera and my map and trying to experience every different neighborhood I could, go to all kinds of galleries and things. And everywhere I went, every time I sat down for dinner at an outdoor cafe, a man would try to sit down beside me and start up a conversation. I'd be approached on the bridge when I'm taking photos. A man followed me into the subway, making me really quite nervous because he just wasn't getting the point. And the women as well were also approaching me. They have little scams that they do, and while they're trying to do this little scam, you might notice they have a partner behind you that's trying to pickpocket you. So I kind of had my defenses up and I didn't know how to express it. So I asked a gallerist if she could give me a tidy little phrase to sort of defend myself. And this was it. Cassez-vous et laissez-moi seul. It can be interpreted in different ways. I think what I intend it to mean and what they get it as, best known in the English language, would be fuck off and leave me alone. Yeah. And guess what? It worked. I did get my chance to try it out, and the guys got it. They got it all right. They're like, sorry, and they go hightailing it the other direction. So I was really happy about that. And it gave me my chance to have my freedom to explore Paris. But I do think it ties back in nicely with greed as a social lubricant. I mean, you can only be asked so many times by so many people before you just want to say, fuck off, just fuck off. And I'm sure, Marie Antoinette having all these, salacious rumors about her sleeping with everybody she knew, being accused of everybody's problem for everything, bad harvest. Well, is it her fault that, they had a harsh winter? No, of course not. But the rich and the privileged are, they're just the ideal scapegoat. They bear the brunt of it. Back then things were a little bit less unfair, but today we have to remember that the wealthiest classes are paying taxes. We live in a democracy. Looking at the others, again, they're addressing things that one isn't really allowed to say. On the far back, this is something I realized very early, probably in my late teens or early 20s, and the interpretation is, I always get what I desire, but I never desire what I get. I think maybe the closest quote that we might be familiar with in pop culture, North American pop culture, is be careful what you wish for. The grass is always greener on the other side. You might get this great job that you want, or you might get, you want to be a celebrity, let's say, but the things that come with it can be really, really terrible. And unfortunately, in a lot of circumstances, we're not allowed to complain, especially if you get a position of privilege. We certainly don't want to hear Kate Middleton complaining, but, there are real human sufferings that go on regardless of class, regardless of gender, regardless of what century it is. To personalize it a little bit more, the one behind Yulia there, the interpretation would be walking on high heels is extremely easy after growing up walking on eggshells. Now, many of you know me as being, quite favorable to my high heels. And people always say the dumbest things to me, like, how do you not fall over? Or, and really it's women are kind of, they're accustomed, not all of us. I mean, some people wear flats their whole life. I've been wearing high heels since I was 15 years old. But it's silly little things like that, that the idea of suffering for my fashion is nothing compared to the suffering that I endured throughout my childhood. I grew up in a small town in a sort of lower middle class family. And when I think of myself and my friends, my close friends that I grew up with, many of them never graduated high school. Some of them never even made it through junior high. We were constantly exposed to drugs, to drinking at a very young age. I didn't have younger siblings, but those that did were basically left to mother their younger siblings. We were responsible for all of the housework. We basically became housewives at, before we were 10 years old. And when I think about the idea that in these small towns back in the 80s, how date rape wasn't even a term. It was just Saturday night, When I think about how the friends that I grew up with were given so little opportunity or chance for success, when I think of the suffering that I endured personally through constant exposure to violence, so it kind of puts things into perspective and grounds me and reminds me of where I come from and how lucky I am today. And that little one behind Murray, that's actually, I'm not sure how well it fits this show other than formally, but I dedicated that one to his aunt. She, can I talk about this, Marie? She is a survivor. She survived the Holocaust. She was in Auschwitz, one of the, I think, the single most notorious death camp in history. And she was forced into slave labor. She survived the death march, though she did lose her toes in the freezing cold. She survived being raped by the Nazis. She survived tuberculosis, which she caught in those circumstances. And I only got to know her just in the last 10 years, and she shared these extraordinary stories with me. And we lost her in, I believe it was this February. And it wasn't a sad thing at that time. Had she died in Auschwitz, it would have been tragic. And she wouldn't have wanted to die, I don't think. But by the time she was the age that I knew her, she wanted to die. Her vision was failing, her hearing was failing, her organs were failing. She had lived this long, hard life, and she wanted to die. And at one point she developed pneumonia in the hospital, and she was on life support. And we all said our goodbyes. And we took her off life support, and we waited. And we waited, and we waited. And then she woke up and asked for breakfast. And I remember about 6 months ago her trying to get Murray to kill her, basically. Tell Dr. Halprin to just give me something. So, hence the phrase, death is inconsiderate. It doesn't come when we want it. It could come at any time. It could come when we don't deserve it. It could come when we're 20. It could come when we're 90. It doesn't come when we hope for. And it's not always kind or convenient. Certainly, I think the royal family knew that. So, in summary, I just wanted to I think you probably got it, but I just wanted to summarize that I wanted this exhibition to be a reflection on civilized society. I wanted to draw the contradictions that exist, that things are never black and white. I wanted to bring out some of these taboo topics. At my opening, I saw a friend and I said, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And she kind of went, she said, I said, it's okay, tell me. And she says, to tell you the truth, my mother just died. This is the first time I've been out of the house. I came to see your show, and it's the first time I've been out of the house in 2 weeks. And I said, you know what? That's okay, because that's what this show is about. It's about saying the things that we're not supposed to say. I'm not supposed to say that, I was abused as a child, or, we're not supposed to say, I'm in great pain, or, I've just, oh, how are you today? Oh, I've just had my second miscarriage, but otherwise I'm fine, And unfortunately, this becomes very dehumanizing. By putting up this false front, these protocols of civilized society or polite society, that there are things we can talk about. When I go to the VAG and I see, friends there, we're supposed to talk about travel and art and things like that. We don't talk about really important things. I think it's only in more intimate, personalized settings that we're able to really have those meaningful conversations. And when I finished installing the work on the walls, I was quite pleased because I thought that it created a look and a feeling of intimacy. Almost like we're in an interior, a home or something. And I was really pleased with that because the work itself is about intimacy. Intimate thoughts of my own, intimate personal sufferings, and just to kind of get those things out there. Marie Antoinette was not able to be alone, to have personal time. So in a way, had these been historical paintings, they never would have been produced. She always had an entourage with her. She couldn't even dress or bathe by herself. I can't imagine what that's like. I love spending time alone in my studio. And that was a privilege that some people never get. I guess I'd like to open it up to questions now. I could always go on with, there's something else that you might think is obvious that I haven't spoken about, but does anybody have a question at this point? Lilac?
At what point did you become interested in Marie Antoinette?
I did see the Sofia Coppola film when it first came out. I've watched it a few times and I thought it was great. And I had gone to Paris a couple times before, but had never gone out to Versailles. So the next time I went to Paris after seeing the film, I decided to take the train out to Versailles and see this magnificent place and to step into history. And it was quite spectacular. Kind of garish in some ways. The interior decor, I thought, ooh, who would put those colors together? But I've tried to keep the really garish ones out of my own work simply because I can't stand them aesthetically. I actually have a physical reaction to certain things like that. But at the time that I was in Paris, that was I guess in June and July of 2011, I was also meeting Parisians, real Parisian women. And there was a gallery there that was interested in representing me. And I left with the idea that I really became inspired about wanting to know more about the history of Paris. But I knew that it was such an extensive history. There was no way I could take it all in. So I decided to find a focal point. And so I thought about, okay, what about women in France? What about historical figures? And Marie Antoinette seemed the obvious choice. Some people, some curators have suggested that Marie Antoinette is a metaphor for myself in these photos. That could or could not be true. So she became sort of an obvious choice. We both love fashion. We both love the arts. Love patronizing both of those. And I feel that she was misunderstood. I feel that I'm often misunderstood. Sometimes the object of rumors that there's nothing I can do a thing about. And when I got back from Paris, I began exploring further. I began buying every book I could, watching every documentary I could, particularly after the end of the Sofia Coppola film. The royal family is leaving Versailles, and you don't know what happens after that. I really wanted to know what happened after. And unfortunately, it got really bad after that point. And that was really inspiring because I wanted to tell her story. That sort of gets me to the point that a lot of artists talk about, but something that I don't really care that much about, and that is process. I'm surprised nobody asked about process, how these were done. So they are all photos that I've taken. I've now gone to Versailles on 4 different day trips, and I've accumulated an archive of literally thousands of photos to work from. When I shoot like this, I don't always have, or at least during the first 2 visits, I didn't have an exact idea of what I was doing. I was simply collecting possibilities and hoping to put something together later. A really pivotal moment, though, was when I walked into this great room in the Grand Trianon, and they had this exhibit that I wasn't aware that I was going to encounter, an exhibit of these gowns. And my heart leapt, and I grabbed my camera, and I started taking as many photos as I could, as quickly as I could. And there were lots of other people around me too, shooting with their little point and shoots, their cell phones, things like that. And the guard came up to me and gave me a tut-tut and asked me to stop taking photos. And I kind of gave him a dirty look because the other 20 people are taking photos, and I understood the circumstances. No flash, okay? I have a very high-speed setting on my camera. No flash, no problem. All of the gowns were housed behind velvet ropes, areas we couldn't enter, so a lot of them were quite far back. I couldn't get close to them, which bothered me to no end. And they had horrific lighting on them, spotlights, in this really dark, dingy room. And right away, I knew I was, everything kind of clicked into place because I'd been doing self-portraiture for most of my artistic career, on and off, and an idea. I knew I was taking them back to my studio, and I knew that a great project was about to begin. So each photo is actually the result of 3 different photo shoots. The first one is going to be, of course, the setting. The second one is the gown, and the third one is myself shot in my studio. So when I got back to my studio in Vancouver, I got myself a corset so I could properly fit the attire. I got a Halloween wig and started researching what they would have been wearing in terms of makeup, manicures, jewelry, and I tried to emulate it as best I possibly could from my resources. Each shot would have taken probably about 40 different poses. I was working with a 10-second self-timer. I always shoot alone in my studio. I'm running back and forth in high heels and a corset and, this horrible wig that I can't see out of, and taking these images. Eventually I would find just the right turn of the body to fit the gowns, and extensive hours in Photoshop to basically work like a cutout doll. Most of us had cutout dolls, well, at least the women, paper dolls when we were little. I like to think of my process like that, sort of cutout dolls. And through a lot of painstaking hours in Photoshop, I was able to emulate quite a reasonable facsimile of actually being there in these gowns, in this place. And of course, trying different gowns to sort of aesthetically coincide with the environment, the story I want to tell, but also aesthetically dealing with issues of balance, color composition. A lot of people say I photograph like a painter. Those key elements are really just so ingrained in me. Things like color theory and lighting, and the gowns that had horrible lighting had to go in dimmer rooms, and the ones that had a big spotlight on them had to go where there was a big sun flare coming in or outside. There's only so much that I can do with Photoshop, and getting the mannequins out of them and rebuilding things like sleeves onto my arms, and getting a mannequin, a dress that's on a standing mannequin, to sit down on the couch. It was a real challenge for my Photoshop skills. But like I say, process is not the most important thing to me. I will go to any means